everybody. We're here again, interviewing somebody who can help round up our knowledge of how to fight for our rights and fight for the rights of our children. We've got some pretty big fights in the UK coming up, not least because we've got the Children and Wellbeing Bill, which is as yet unpublished, but in the words of a friend of mine, it's going to be like the schools bill on acid. So we're just prepping for that. So it's really good to update our knowledge and to round up our knowledge in how the system works, how we can get our voices heard when there's all these people out there that we don't understand and things like that. And I'm here with my really good friend, Russ, who was once upon a time an MP in Canada. Hi, Russ.
Hi, Alison.
Russ and I know each other through the Global Home Education Exchange. We met in Zagreb, I believe, at the European Conference. And we have just recently been at the Manchester conference, which was the Global Home Education Conference in July. And Russ did the most fantastic presentation, and we were all wowed by this presentation. So he's very kindly agreed to sort of represent it here on video so that we can use his knowledge and his expertise to help our fight. So Russ, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Or do you want me to get onto the first slide where it says a little bit about you already?
Sure. Why don't you just move ahead with the slides?
Yeah.
That's great.
Cool. Okay. So let's see if we can, there we go.
Yeah, so in terms of my background, I'm a dad of 4 teenagers, former lawyer, and as you mentioned, a 4-time elected politician here in Canada. I'm also on the board of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. So I've been doing that since I left politics in 2015. And it's given me a real insight into what's happening across our country and around the world through our involvement with the Global Home Education Exchange. But our family's been doing this for 13 years, and I've watched each of my kids go through that process. We have one that's graduated now and is in university. And so I can say that I'm a wholehearted convert to the benefits of home education, and I've seen it firsthand. So the question often comes up, so why get involved? Why try and influence public policy? I think it's imperative that parents in particular protect and expand the legal rights of home education. It's an obligation that parents have, but it's also a right that they have to participate in the political process. And if nothing else, you want to improve conditions for the next generation in terms of addressing the current regulations that might limit your freedom to home educate. And I do really believe that the amount of liberty that people have when it comes to education and the options that they are provided is a reflection of the degree that liberty exists in a nation. And I think my encouragement to parents is to seize the opportunity to expand that liberty. I'm not as familiar as you are, Alison, with what's happening in the UK, but I know that in Canada, there's a variety of freedoms. In my province of British Columbia, it's actually, home education is actually supported directly and indirectly. But in other provinces, like in Quebec, it's much, much less so. In fact, it's very onerous to home educate your kids. But in all of our provinces, people are standing up and they're getting involved, and they're influencing their legislatures to create more of an environment for freedom.
So just a little bit of clarification. So like the UK has 4 different legislative territories for education, because education is devolved. In Canada, you have provinces and states, don't you, where there's separate legislation for that?
Yeah, so our Constitution divides the responsibility of education to the provinces, not the federal government. So each province can have its own education policy, and they do vary quite a bit. Alberta probably has the most, I think, supportive choices for parents when it comes to education, and then British Columbia would be a close second to that, where in British Columbia, the provincial government doesn't pay for parents to home educate their kids, but they do provide some financial support when they register their child in an online or distance learning program. Now, parents have the option of simply registering their kids, which means they get no support whatsoever, and that's totally fine. But for those that want to register their kids, with a online school or a distance learning program, they get, that institution gets a little bit, a modest amount, maybe I think about a third of what a public school would get in terms of tax dollars following the child. But ultimately, I think the best choice is what we're seeing now in a few US states, where the tax dollars actually follow the child no matter where they go, whether it's public, private, home education. I think in Arizona, they're experimenting with that option of pure um, choice in education. And I think that is the model that would be the one that I would strongly advocate for.
Yeah, I think they have it in Florida as well. There's certainly a lot of it in Florida. Yeah, definitely. Okay.
All
Uh,
right.
so moving on.
Yeah. The key point to this slide was that the policies that exist anywhere on any topic are simply a reflection of the opinions of the elected representatives and the bureaucrats. Um, a great way to summarize this would be to say, people are policy, right? The people reflect the policy that exists. And so if you can't persuade people to change their policies, sorry about that, um, then you need to change the elected representatives. But ultimately, changing their opinions is what this presentation is about. And it's your right to do that, right? Like, we still live in a democracy where it's supposed to be representative government,
Hmm.
and the views that are held in our governments, the policies that are implemented, should be reflecting the views of the electorate. And
Yeah.
that's what this process is all about.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I'm constantly saying this, if you don't tell the representatives that you have, your MP, for example, your MSP if you're in Scotland, your assembly member, whoever it happens to be, if you don't tell them the way it is, the problems you've had, the problems you face, the reasons you home educate, what home education looks like for you, they're going to be informed by somebody else, and that somebody else might be somebody who's not keen on home education,
Yeah.
and might frighten them about what's happening with home educated children, etc. So let's get in there first and educate our representatives about what we do, and then they can go forward at least with the facts at their fingertips.
Yeah. Now, I add one other point to this one, and that is there's sometimes a question: do we focus on the bureaucrats or do we focus on the elected representatives? And my original emphasis was to focus on the elected representatives because they actually have the power to tell the bureaucrats how to change the law or what policies to change. But I think it was one of my encounters with you, Alison, where I was reminded that bureaucrats have a lot of influence as well, and they have a longer lifespan in government than most elected officials. So you don't want to neglect the building those relationships with the people behind the scenes that can
Absolutely.
provide advice to the minister or to the other MPs.
Yeah, and if you want a lesson in how that works, you just need to watch Yes Minister. It might be old, but it's still true.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so I think we've just touched on that key point there, is focusing on elected officials, but not ignoring the bureaucrats. And then the bottom point there being, remember that it took a long time for these policies to get where they are today. And it's going to anticipate that it might take some time to change the law to the direction that you want to go. But when
And
you do change the law, it's usually lasting and impactful.
yeah, and everything feeds into it. You've got to remember that there are several that if you imagine it like a manufacturing plant, there are several feeds into this sausage machine, and
Yes.
one of the feeds is media. So everything that you do will feed into the impressions and the opinions, etc. Bits of research, all sorts of things. And if you can at least be pushing down all those different lines of supply, the right message, ultimately it does join up at Parliament in some way or another, or with the bureaucrats. And with a bit of luck, if you've got it coming from all sides, they are going to actually hear what it really is. There's a lot of fake news out there. What can I say? And a lot of rumor and rhetoric, and that's my thing anyway. That
Mhm.
they'll create evidence based on their own desire for policy, and they'll use rumor and rhetoric to the nth degree to do it.
That unfortunately that does happen all too often.
Yeah.
So then when you get to that place of recognizing who you want to influence, you have to define the issue very carefully. And that means knowing exactly what you're wanting to accomplish, and understanding how the current law affects or impacts home education. Because if you don't understand the issue carefully and well, you'll have difficulty communicating that and affecting the change that you want to accomplish. And so that means becoming informed, researching it, knowing the history. How did the law come to be where it is today? What its current status? And then coming up with potential solutions or options that you can provide. And then using evidence and data. And thankfully, certainly what we saw at the Global Home Education Conference in Manchester was there's robust amounts of academic research that supports the benefits of home education. And that can be drawn on, right? Because that's a form of persuasive knowledge that policymakers, will consider carefully.
And I think you've got to be really careful about when you use the research. Certainly in Europe, we have to make sure that we use as local research as possible. So start with the research that's from your own country and move outwards. Maybe use some European research, etc. There's a great piece of research that came out a couple of years ago that I've only just discovered in Spain that looks at mental health outcomes for schooled children versus home educated children, for example. So that's a really good one, especially with the mental health issues right now. And there's been a PhD thesis published a couple of days ago by somebody who was at our conference, who was looking at the outcomes. So keep abreast of it, and being informed about the issue's history. Talk to people like me who've been around for, I've been around in home education for 25 years now. That's a quarter of a century. Come and ask before you do. Come and ask about the history of the issue so that you get the understanding and you can be really well informed.
Yeah, that's so very important to know the background.
Yep. So,
all right. So develop a clear message. The key point here is to have 3 points. Identify the issue, identify your perspective, and then identify the proposed or the desired outcome. And this is something that politics taught me really, really well, is the importance of, we call them talking points, but zoning carefully on the problem, the solution, and that makes such an important difference because you're dealing with busy people. You don't want to get distracted with rabbit hole issues. You want to stay focused on the key issue, and this just develops some discipline in your messaging.
Yeah, definitely. And I have to say the number of times that I see correspondence with MPs, etc., and they it's like a big ranty moan about what has happened to them, but there's never a solution. And if you don't have the solution at the end, they've got nowhere to go with it, So give them the solution as well. It's really, really important. A bit like when you're writing a complaint, the number of people who just write the complaint, say, I'm writing to complain about da 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 da, and then forget what they want to say that will remedy it. And if you don't put that in, you end up with a bit of a problem. Yeah.
So it could be a little bit like, be clear about what you want, and then propose a solution, and then be ready to explain why. Why this policy is a problem and how it affects the local community, and how, in this case, home education works better, as a better solution in practice. So, for example, let's say there's a law or a regulation in place right now that makes it difficult to comply with. It's a barrier. It's a funnel to using home education. Explain that, and then explain how the law could be changed to make it easier, right? To remove that obstacle. The point number 4 there, it talks about choosing your words carefully. And, that applies to life generally. But if certain phrases in your community are deemed to have negative connotations to them, well, then choose your words to describe the situation in words that are more affirming or more neutral, at least. One that I've grown to like lately is this whole concept of parent-directed education. Homeschooling sometimes leave people with the connotation that you want to replicate the institutional setting in a residential environment. And that's not really what home education is all about. It's more about changing who's in charge from the institution to the parent. And that's why parent-directed education, I think, is a better moniker for what happens around the world.
Yeah, and parent directed doesn't mean it's not child led. It just means that it's within the purview of the parent rather than within the state system, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And then obviously you need to know who you're talking to. So determine who your elected representative is. They're going to be far more interested in your views if they are your representative. Identify the Minister of Education, and sometimes there's a Deputy Minister of Education, or in parliamentary systems, a Parliamentary Secretary for Education.
We have
And
a Secretary of State for Education in England, and then we also have a lot of junior ministers under them. So you have to figure out which minister it is, and it's the Minister for Schools in England who deals with home education, of course.
yeah, so once you've identified those people, then learn to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. It's possible that what you might be asking of them is outside their scope or area of responsibility. So you kind of need to figure that out. And that can happen in conversation with them, or in just doing some research, or with talking to their staff.
One of the things that Andrew said to me in the last interview I did was that, particularly with the ruling party, if you know that legislation is coming up but has not yet been laid before Parliament, it's a good idea to have a discussion with your elected representative who's a member of the ruling party, because they can actually influence how the legislation is written if they've got a heads up as to what the problems might be with it. So that's them, and then that can lead to discussions with the minister yourself, in actual fact. So there's some funny little ways around you can go that actually have massive impact.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key points you're touching on that we'll talk about in a minute, is keeping track of legislation. But whether it's with your local MP or the minister or anybody for that matter, this is kind of human relationship norms. You want to think about this as not a confrontational relationship, but a positive relationship. So that when you meet with your elected representative, it's not, oh, there's no dread involved. There's actually, oh, I recognize you, or I'm looking forward to this experience because we have had positive associations in the past. So what's worked with me when people contacted me was, when people would say, oh, I know so-and-so, a mutual friend or a mutual colleague, or where there's a personal connection there, it helps build the bridge. And that can sometimes be influential. And then, of course, basic courtesies apply: smile, be respectful, and give sincere appreciation if it's earned.
Yeah, and be nice to the staff, not just the elected representative, because they can get you a long way. They can get you in the door or not.
You're right on. We'll be touching on that in a minute when we try and schedule a meeting.
Okay.
So, here's something that we've learned in Canada lately. A couple of examples. That is, join advocacy groups that share your goal. You may not share all of the perspectives of the people out in the field who are also trying to influence things, but working with other people to strategize, to network, can really amplify your efforts. If you combine, if you realize there's an overlap between what you're trying to accomplish and what other people are trying to accomplish, don't work in a silo if you can work with other people and cooperate. And an example of this that we saw last year in 2023 was the Million March for Children. In that situation, there were some Muslim parents in Toronto that were really upset about what was happening in schools. And so they simply declared, and this is the power of declaration, right? They simply declared in October, we're going to have a march with 1 million people across Canada in protest to to the ideologies that are being taught in our public schools. And simply by making that declaration and setting up a website and doing a little bit of coordinating, they ended up getting hundreds of thousands of people across Canada. It's hard to measure exactly how many people showed up, but we do know that there was, gatherings in probably 30, 40, maybe 50 cities across the country. the one in our city had 4 to 5,000 people, maybe more, and it was a massive impact. And that's not to say that everybody shared all the perspectives of these Muslim families, but there was enough of an overlap that people were concerned about what was happening in education, that disparate groups who would not otherwise work together ended up combining forces for this great show of discontent with what was happening. So be aware that there might be other groups that you wouldn't otherwise normally work with that can be your allies in this
Yeah, so
process.
these weren't just Muslim parents in the end, they were just parents who had a problem. And so what they had in common was the common goal of we've got a problem with the common issue of we've got a problem with what's being taught, let's do something about it.
Yeah,
They didn't necessarily come from the same perspective, but the thing that they had in common, they just concentrated on that. And it is very easy sometimes, and I've seen this happen at festivals and things like that, to become distracted away from the point that you are supposed to be there for. You've got to keep the focus on that, especially if you are organizing the protest. You have to keep the focus and remind people not to go off on side campaigns and to
yeah.
stick very closely with the focus, because that way you'll get the biggest support by keeping that focus.
Yeah, exactly. You're so right, Alison. You set aside the differences and focus on the things you have in common. Another example was this whole idea of engaging in grassroots organizing. And that happened 2 years earlier in 2022. The point of this line here is to work on grassroots movements because they have a a particular influence on public policy, because when something gets fire, like, so we talk about grassroots being like the ordinary folk across the country. When they get agitated or they get mobilized, things can change, rapidly or dramatically. And an example of that was in 2022. Regardless of what your view of the mandates during the COVID period, there was a group of truckers who were simply really upset about what was being forced upon them, and they started a grassroots movement that spread across the country
Mm.
and ended up changing dramatically public policy in a relatively short period of time, just by, again, kind of putting themselves out there, and the support that grew and grew and grew until it became a national historic issue. So you can never underestimate the power of taking initiative and inviting other people to join you along the way.
And sometimes you don't know what's going to happen, because we were talking about this freedom convoy earlier, and it started off as like people moving across, and it kind of snowballed and snowballed and snowballed. And then you said by the time it got to the East Coast, it ended up like being a carnival atmosphere or a festival atmosphere. And it was that sounds so wonderful, that instead of it being a lot of angry, spitting, stabby protesters, it was a lot of people just coming together with their common goal, again sticking with the common goal,
Yeah,
and being human with each other. Yeah.
yeah. Being respectful, being human, but also not willing to. They wanted to be heard, and so they demonstrated courtesy, respect, and we're expecting the same thing in reciprocation. All right, so then what this point of this slide is to talk about the different ways of influencing elected officials. And as I mentioned at the time, there's a hierarchy of influence that can happen. People will think, well, if I send an email, then maybe that'll be enough, but it's not as effective as actually writing a letter. Um, Sometimes people circulate pre-written letters, which are recognized in the staff as such. A personalized letter is always better. If you can put your own thoughts down and sign your name. More impactful than a letter is a phone call, because now you have the elected officials' time and attention. But the most effective thing you can do, have an in-person meeting with the elected representative. And I think the next slide talks about how we can accomplish that. So when you're asking for a meeting, understand that these people are really, really busy. So generally my advice is to request a meeting in the constituency as opposed to in the capital, because they're probably less busy. I think in the UK you call them surgeries. That's another place that you can be, during or after one of those.
Yeah,
And
surgeries come in two varieties in the UK, depending on your elected official. Some surgeries are by appointment only, other surgeries are drop-in. So make sure you check on the website of your particular elected official so you know which it is.
yeah, and then as you pointed out, be sure that you're nice to the staff because the staff can determine whether or not you even get a meeting. And if they're treated poorly, they will certainly pass that experience along to their boss. And then this is a key one, bring other people with you, because it really changes the dynamic. If you go in alone, that's not bad. But if you go in with two or three or more individuals, it's far more difficult for the person that you're meeting with to dismiss your views as being, uh, isolated or just those of an individual when they represent a larger group. A story that I like to tell about this is that my first contact with home educated students was when they came, um, to my office. And I had been to schools and encountered students a number of times, but when a group of home educated students and parents came to my office in my constituency, and they asked really good questions and they were very respectful, it left a very positive impression on me. So that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
This is another thing that happens more frequently, I think, in the US, and that's called organizing Parliament days, is what we would call them for you, or Capital days is what they call them in the US. And that's where, on an annual basis, parents and students would go to the Capitol on a one day, given advance notice to the elected officials that they're going to be there. Maybe they bring them cookies, maybe they sit on committee meetings, but the goal is to meet with their representative, as many other representatives as they can, just to put a face to who they are, and so that these elected representatives can get to know them. And if they do this on an annual basis, when let's say somebody brings forward legislation that would be detrimental to home education, well, these politicians can now think, well, I know some home educated families, and they're pretty normal. In fact, they're pretty cool. And I wouldn't want to do anything that would affect them. So I'm going to reach out to them and consult them, or I'm going to, maybe oppose this legislation because I know this is a group that's worth protecting. So that's part of this building relationship experience that we talked about earlier. And then interest with theirs, the key point there is um, elected officials, they want to get reelected, of course. And so we want to show them how, by supporting the policies that you are advocating for, it's good for society. And that if they support this policy, it will help them get reelected. And that's the kind of alignment that I'm talking about here.
Yeah,
Uh,
just to bear in mind, in the UK right now, we've got 300 baby MPs. That is MPs who've never been an MP before. They all are swaddling around trying to find a soapbox. Give them their soapbox.
yeah, exactly. Uh, this is a perfect opportunity to, because they're kind of like a blank slate, to go in and make a positive first impression so that they understand that during the next 4 years, if something come up, they can go to you as a resource. And I'm sure you're already doing that, Alison, but other people across the country can take that tip as well. I know that the election has just passed now in the UK, but one thing that I noticed during my 4 elections was that when volunteers participated in my campaigns in whatever capacity, and then they later came back to me during the session and said, "Hey, I have a concern about this, or I want you to consider this." It's human nature to be responsive to the people that have helped you get reelected. There's a desire to reciprocate, and so if you really want to build credibility with your elected representatives, then volunteer during campaigns, between elections. That showing up at their events, that goes a long way to building that relationship that we talked about earlier. Number 10, participate in public hearings. That's the phase that you guys are now in. So as these things come up and as these bills get proposed, stay alert. It's far easier to win something before it passes than after. So attend the hearings, be a witness, support or oppose legislation. Propose legislation is something else that you could think of. You don't have to be simply reactive. You can take initiative and be, responsive. So that, just stay engaged. It does require a little bit more effort, but off in the long term. And then support. Yeah. So we talked about support or oppose legislation, and then exercise your right to vote. That's the key point in number 12. And if you can't find somebody to vote for, then consider being the candidate. This is what representative democracy is all about, right? The people that are there are no different than you and I, and don't underestimate your ability to fill that position and take on that responsibility. It's the kind of position that there's no real preparation for it in life. So you learn as, but I assure you that far more people could fulfill those roles than currently think is possible. But just remember, they're no different than you. So consider that.
Just locally, we had the person who beat Nigel Evans was she's a Girl Guide leader like me. She runs Girl Guides, Girl Scouts. And when she started her campaign, she had no idea that she thought she was the outlier. Yeah. But somehow she's a local girl. She connected with people. There were some local issues particular to things like girl guiding and some other things. And she really, really lit a fire under the electorate. And it was amazing. Amazing. It was lovely to see. Yeah. It's always sad when somebody loses their seat, but sometimes you get a really good person come in anyway. So yeah.
And then stay persistent and patient, as we talked about earlier. Yeah, this is a long game, so often change takes time. So stay involved, and recognize that progress is sometimes slow, and the elected officials that you're trying to influence may need time to evaluate and respond, because these are sometimes complex issues. And then when you do achieve something, acknowledge those achievements and thank the officials, and thank your volunteers, and recognize the accomplishments that you've made, because they're often not frequent enough, but you need to recognize when you've moved the ball down the field, and that keeps everybody motivated.
Okie dokie. Thanks. There we go.
Yeah, so hopefully applying these suggestions will help you succeed. This is information that I've learned from my experience in politics, not just during the time that I was elected, but also my involvement before and after my direct participation in public policy.
Well, Russ, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. I am very grateful for you to come along and do this, and thank you very much.